Welcome. I'm Bill Magwood. I'm Director General of the Nuclear Energy Agency. It's my pleasure to open today's session. We have been all experiencing a very unusual situation over the last several months. This pandemic has affected almost every aspect of life. And one thing that we have seen consistently around the world is a greater awareness of the importance of a reliable supply of electricity. In that respect, there's been a lot of conversation about what comes next. How do we prepare for the future? And we believe that nuclear energy has a very important role to play, and that is really the subject of today's conversation. We believe that as countries recover from the COVID crisis, they should both recognize what they have learned over the last several months, which is reliable electricity is essential for life and for economy. And it will be even more essential as we go forward and become more electrified as more electricity is used for transportation, for industry, and for many other purposes. We expect to see electricity demand in developed countries increase quite substantially as electrification moves forward. And as that happens, there'll be greater importance to assure that the reliability, the cost of electricity is predictable and conducive for economic development. It's also very important to recognize that we have to prepare for the energy transition, the transition to a low carbon economy. In that respect, countries have many decisions to make. For some countries, it'll be very easy to use large amounts of renewables because of the types of resources they have, or perhaps they have hydro resources that make it a lot easier to make a transition. For many other countries, there are more difficult choices to be made. We believe for most countries, there will be a situation where renewables will increase quite substantially, but they will never be 100% of the supply. The question then becomes, what do we do for the rest? That's where we believe that nuclear energy has an important role to play in many countries. Not all countries will build nuclear power plants, there's no question of that, but many are now today looking at nuclear as an option for the long-term future. Both the large light water reactors that we're very familiar with, but also new technologies, small modular reactors, microreactors, generation 4 reactors. All of these are being discussed around the world. Today, we have a very distinguished panel, which is going to look at this issue about how nuclear can fit into the future low carbon economy. As you heard earlier, we prepared a series of policy briefs to examine these issues in some detail. And as we consider how we're going to have a cost-effective electricity supply, build jobs, deal with financing issues and resilience issues, all these briefs are available on our website, as you can see on this display. The discussion about carbon neutrality and electricity decisions in a cost-effective manner is one of our earlier releases. And to explain this in a little bit more detail, I'm going to invite Senior Economic Advisor for the NEA, Dr. Jan Horst Kepler, to give you a presentation to explain this in greater detail. So, Dr. Kepler, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. Hello to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about nuclear power and the cost-effective decarbonization of electricity. We'll start right with the first slide about the COVID-19 crisis and the imperative of cost-effective decarbonization. The pandemic and the related policy responses underlined the paramount importance of technically and economically robust electricity systems. I think we all experienced, as the world moved online, a stable electricity supply was as indispensable to us as food security or access to healthcare. Now, the recovery plans, they all strive to be green, but they will have to contend with new financial constraints. So they're aiming for an environmental, economic, and social triple dividend. That means, at the very least cost solutions for the low carbon electricity systems of the future, and a number of structural reforms in electricity markets. As you're probably aware, low carbon technologies such as nuclear, such as variable renewables like wind or solar PV or hydro, even storage, all come with very high fixed costs. Also the infrastructures for transmission distribution that we will know, and that will require greater visibility for revenues, some changes in market designs, and it also requires to take a systems approach, something the NEA in recent years has studied repeatedly. Just to give you sort of a number of hints on what such a systems approach does consist of, which is in the next slide. We have the system costs that are often due to variability or low energy density, or the location dependence of wind and solar PV. The fact that renewables such as wind and solar PV are variable, we call that profile costs, because we need more of dispatchable backup to provide electricity when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. We have some balancing costs because renewable production is not always predictable, so we need some dispatchable power plants that are basically online, in standby, so that they can come online in seconds or minutes. And then finally, we have added transmission and distribution costs because of this low energy density and the location dependence of these resources. One point though, these system costs depend very much on the particular characteristics of the existing generation mix or a country's sort of general qualities. The load, the structure of demand is very important, the amount of flexibility resources, hydro storage, interconnections, and of course, which other generation resources you have at your disposal. And we looked at several different systems with different shares of either renewables or nuclear, again in the next slide. And there you see different systems, all with 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And we'll look at the left graph first. There at the very left column, you have a least cost base case with only nuclear low carbon production, no renewables, because they're the low cost option, the least cost option with the numbers that we use. And then you increase the share of variable renewables, 10%, 30%, 50%, with different flexibility constellations, and 75%. Costs will go up a little bit because they're more expensive at the plant level, that's the green part. But you also have the red and the blue and gray parts, which are these system costs. And you see with 75% variable renewables, same carbon constraints as the base case, 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, you have about 70 to 80% higher overall costs for satisfying precisely the same demand. Moving towards the right graph, it's the same story told somewhat differently. This is now allocated, those added system costs, to each unit of renewable production, to each megawatt hour based on the basis of generated on the basis of wind or solar PV. And you see that the costs, the true costs, that's a real economic metric to judge those costs of adding the system cost to the cost of renewables would increase by about $50 per megawatt hour, the cost of a megawatt hour of wind or solar PV, if you had 75% of them in the system. If you only had 10%, these system costs would be substantially lower and only about $7 to $8 per megawatt hour. I also draw your attention to the large impact of flexibility resources that you see when you look at the case with 50% renewables. If you take away the interconnections and the flexible hydro resources, then indeed the system cost per megawatt hour will increase from about $30 to about $50. That's what I said earlier, that the context is indeed hugely important. Can we move on to the next slide, which basically shows what happens if we move from these 50 grams per kilowatt hour, which roughly correspond to the objectives of the Paris Agreement, to total decarbonization of the electricity sector. Look again at the left graph. There you see this dark blue line. That's the 50 grams that we just talked about. As you move from left to right, more renewables, costs go up, and you're moving from the light blue zone towards the green zone. But now what happens if you're really trying to go from 50 grams to 1 or to 0 grams per kilowatt hour, total decarbonization? There you're moving up from the green zone to the red zone, to this dark red zone, which means really costs really do explode. This is something that was done by the same modeling team with whom we worked for our results at MIT, but we didn't include that in our study. That's their own work. Part of that found its way into the Future of Nuclear study, which you might be aware of. What drives these very, very high costs you see on the right-hand graph? It's the yellow part. The yellow part indicates a share of battery storage, which is not only for minutes or for hours, but which we would need in that case really for days, weeks, and even seasons. And that's what making the system really, really expensive if you want to do it all with variable renewables and no nuclear. We will come to the two concluding slides, and there the first one will show you how the value of renewables actually declines as you add them to the system. That's actually something which is sort of the reverse side of that system cost medal. The more and more wind in blue and solar in red you add, the less it actually, in terms of capacity, the less it actually adds in value. Because each additional megawatt will produce precisely at those hours when all the other megawatts are already producing, and not in the hours when you would actually need it. And when all the renewables are producing together, then indeed prices and value will fall. So this is one way of looking at system costs. And if you would have sort of a perfect market, they would stop coming in, even if they would be less expensive on a plant level basis. And that's modeled in the right-hand graph. And the base case, which I already talked about, that's you have all nuclear, and that's the least cost option, because right now nuclear is still cheaper even at the plant level into LCOE terms. However, let's assume a future where wind and solar PV and LCOE terms at the plant level would indeed be cheaper than nuclear. What would then happen? These are the green parts you see on the right column. They would come in on their own merits, as they should, cheapest option. But as you keep on adding them, their value to the system is getting less and less and less, and even in the perfect market, they would stop coming in because they wouldn't yield any more value. And then nuclear or another dispatchable low carbon source, the red part there, would come in on its own merits, even if its LCOEs were slightly higher. But the overall least cost system that we would want to have in order to cost effectively decarbonize would have a sizable share of renewables and a sizable share of nuclear. Despite differences in plant level LCOE costs, but due to the system costs, there will be an equilibrium between the two, and that will be the least cost option. How can we get there? That's the last slide that will tell that. What do policymakers need to do? There are two important, the two most important measures here are the two first one. First of all, give a carbon price signal. Clearly indicate in terms of decarbonization what the value of different resources, tax or other measures, the fossil fuel emitting generation options, or give subsidies to the low cost generation options. Second point, as said, all these low carbon options are high investment cost options, high fixed cost options, and so investors do need some stability over time. We need some signal that can be a tariff, a long-term contract, a feed-in tariff, a contract for differences. There are different ways of sort of organizing that in different electricity systems, but there needs to be some price stability for investors. These are the two most important measures. These next three ones are also important, but slightly less so. We still need short-term markets for cost-efficient dispatch. Markets are great for regulating dispatch in electricity. They're not so great for organizing investments for the reasons that we just mentioned. We need capacity, flexibility, transmission systems, distribution systems. All of this will probably be provided on a tariff basis rather than by merchant market provision in regulated contexts, which is already the case. And finally, we need to recognize and fairly allocate the system costs that we just talked about. To sum it all up, cost-effective decarbonization will require suitable policies for the rapid deployment of all available low-carbon technologies, including renewables on the one hand, but of course also including nuclear energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that opening discussion. I think it provides good food for thought as we go into the panel. So let me invite the panel to join us. I will introduce them as they speak, but you can see them all displayed here. And the first one is going to be Scott Foster, who is Director of Sustainable Energy Division for the UN Economic Commission for Europe. He has more than 30 years experience in the energy field, having worked extensively with private companies, governments, and international organizations on strategic decision-making, investments, energy policy, market design, and climate change. So, sir, floor is yours. Please give us your opening comments.
All right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. Although in these unusual circumstances, being there is unusual. I would like to start with the title that I bear, which is the Director of Sustainable Energy, because I think that has a bearing on what we're discussing today. The Director of Sustainable Energy, the issue of what do we mean by sustainable is clearly important. On the one hand, we are talking about climate and reducing the carbon intensity of our energy system and addressing the climate issues is critical. But there's a whole other part of the world that's also worried about the climate, but their first priority is putting food on their table, it's putting a roof over their head, it's teaching their children, educating their children. So the challenge we face is coming up with an integrated solution, which we call energy for sustainable development. Providing the energy that we require, yes, and doing so in a way that meets the climate objectives. So at ECE, we've undertaken a project called the Pathways Project, which is looking at how are we going to achieve energy for sustainable development. And what we find is that pretty much all technologies have to be involved. We're not going to get to 2 degrees without it, and we're not going to deliver on the development agenda. I like to refer to Yogi Berra. He's an American baseball manager. And he always talks about when you come to a fork in the road, take it. He meant take the right fork or the left fork to get to his house. When I talk about a fork in the road, I'm actually talking about the prongs of the fork. And everybody really says we've got to do renewables, we've got to do energy efficiency. And they're absolutely right. But the reality is that 80% of the energy mix today is fossil. And even in a 2-degree scenario, 56% of the energy mix will still be fossil. So we need to do energy efficiency. We need to do renewables. We need to deal with low carbon solutions for fossil. And we have to deal with nuclear. We have to have it as part of the mix. The results show that if we exclude nuclear from the mix, we will not make it. The challenge that we face in the public dialogue, in the public debate, and with governments is that there seems to be an allergic reaction, whether it's talking about investments or policies, towards both fossil and nuclear. Now, if we look at the path that we're on today, we're really heading towards 4 degrees or 6 degrees, and we're getting there faster and faster. And this is true even though we've seen this coming for years, showing my age even more than the introduction did. The first paper I ever looked at, climate change, was actually in 1978. And it would have been much easier had we started dealing with it back then than we are trying to deal with a steeper and steeper cliff. Now, the challenge that we faced, what we're trying to do is we've got to get everybody around the table. Everybody has got to be involved. Wagging our fingers and telling people you're bad people and you shouldn't do what you're doing, it won't deliver. Every country has got its own endowment of natural resources. They've got their own legacy of cultural heritage, legislative heritage, etc. There's not one pathway that's going to take us to our destination. Brazil's going to do what they need to do. Luxembourg is going to do what they need to do. There's a multitude of pathways out there. Whether you're in one country or the other, we should be able to anticipate that governments are acting in our interests as citizens, and that they're going to be acting rationally, rationally socially, rationally environmentally, and rationally economically, the three legs that were described earlier. So even though we have this multitude of pathways, there are some common themes. There does need to be a real price on carbon, and we're not there yet, whether it's a tax or a carbon market. As we move away from carbon-based technologies, there needs to be some kind of a just transition, taking account of these large industrial complexes with the urban communities that have emerged around them. You can't, like Thanos, just snap your finger and wish them away. Now, one of the key drivers, what we're pushing for, is to reinvent energy. Fundamentally reinvent energy as a service industry rather than the commodity industry it's always been. Do this to energy. Up till now, we've always been dealing with, I'm going to make money by selling you kilowatt hours. I'm going to make money by selling you tons of coal, cubic meters of gas. We've got to change that to heating, cooling, mobility, etc. So what we're looking at is focusing on the cross-cutting connections among all of the SDGs. And when we think about energy, it is the golden thread that connects them. We are not going to deliver on that 2030 agenda, which is quality of life globally, unless we get the energy equation right. How do we want to do that? We've got to involve everyone in decision-making to build consensus and to increase public acceptance. Now, the work that we're doing on carbon neutrality right now is looking at the pathways to a sustainable future. Carbon neutrality is a stepping stone. It's a stepping stone to cost-effective attainment of sustainable energy. So we're trying to explore countries' options. We invite everybody on the call to join us. When we get there, we're going to have a proper placement of nuclear, high-efficiency, low-emissions technology for fossil, hydrogen, renewables, energy efficiency, and the rest of it will be part of the sustainable energy mix. We need to be cost-effective in how we reduce the carbon intensity, but that doesn't mean cutting corners. A lot of folks are talking about COVID-19. One of the things that I think jumps out at us is the fallacy of inertia. How many of the things that you've been doing every day, suddenly you stop and say, wow, maybe we could have done this a different way. So there are long-term consequences of all the demand and destruction that we've seen. We do want to build back better. I think a good example is schools. My kids are trying to do telecommuting from school, and all of the teachers are trying to do on the internet the way they've done it in the classroom. That doesn't work. So there's a process reinvention that needs to occur. And that same thing that I just described for schools, it applies pretty much throughout the economy. So today's energy systems are not going to be able to deal with the new crises, extreme weather, future pandemics, supply chain disruptions. Resilience is key. Resilience in the energy system, better organization of cities and our work environment. To go slightly poetic, if we want a phoenix to rise from the ashes of this pandemic, we're going to have to address the quality of life issues for the planet that has 9 billion souls. So we're not looking at today, we're looking at 2050. So we've got to deal with that forward looking, and we have to deliver on our responsibility as caretakers for the natural environment. To quote another American ad, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. I'm going to stop with my formal remarks and see if you've got any questions that you'd like to explore now or with the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Scott. And your quoting of about Mother Nature probably dates you a lot more than that paper did. Let's see. Let me ask you a question before we introduce the next speaker. And that is something that you said towards the end, that we should be looking at 2050. But while we do expect, as you said, for governments to make the right decisions and that's best for their people, they do tend to look at the short term as opposed to the long term. And we hear a lot about how governments would want to restart their economies with new investments in infrastructure and other things. And the question I have for you is, do you think there is an approach that can explain the value of balancing the short term with that long term, with that 2050 perspective?
Actually, yes, I do. Thank you for the question. Clearly, the pandemic continues to unfold, and it's a tragedy that's just not finished, and that is unfortunate. There's nevertheless an opportunity. I think the expression I used was to build back better. There is a need to restart economies. There is a need to invest in jobs and economic activity. But to be able to do so in a way that's aligned with the longer term view is clearly possible. So we should take an advantage of this imperative to restart economies, to align the near term. We've got to get people back to work. We've got the economies working with the long term. I'll use a specific example of buildings. We've got a high performance buildings initiative. And if we could actually get these high performance buildings principles in place, governments with their stimulus packages could be putting money into the hands of carpenters and electricians and architects and the like. That's the jobs front. But to do so in a way that brings in tomorrow's requirements. So you're doing both at the same time. That example on buildings could apply to cities. It could be applying to mobility and to the energy system as a whole. So I think, yes, there is an opportunity.
Another question from the audience that is kind of interesting is, I think you alluded to how we have to start looking at energy as a service. And the question is, how does that relate to the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development?
I think energy as a service is hugely important. There are a lot of embedded inefficiencies in the system. And if my objective is to deliver you energy services, and I'm going to start having a subscription-based provision of your comfort in your home or your comfort in your building, and it becomes incumbent upon me to provide you with the services you require, suddenly it'll become my cost of capital, my technology, my managerial skills that come to bear, rather than a household trying to figure out, do I want to replace that window or I want to go order a pizza on a Saturday night? So by moving to energy as a service, as a concept, you create energy efficiency as part of the business model. And that's a fundamental shift from where we are. So in terms of resource efficiency and energy efficiency and delivering the services that are needed, I think that's a huge opportunity that we have.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And please stay with us. There's a lot of questions coming in, and we'll have a great discussion when the rest of the panel has a chance to speak. So let me introduce the next speaker, which is Laszlo Varró, who is a chief economist with the International Energy Agency. He's been with the IEA since 2011 and became the chief economist at the beginning of 2016. He leads the Economics and Investment Office, a newly created group within the IEA that aims to offer sound and consistent energy economics and methodology support for the agency's work. Mr. Varró, the floor is yours.
Thank
Can
you
you hear
very
me?
much,
Yes,
Dr.
please.
Mahmoud. And if I might add another point from my CV, before joining the IEA, I also served in the supervisory board of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization in Hungary. So I paid my dues to have contribution of nuclear power. So I would start by observing that in the past decade was remarkably successful for wind and solar photovoltaics, characterized by technological progress, larger, higher capacity wind turbines, and also a much better manufacturing process for solar panels. Wind and solar deployment took place at a much higher scale than at the beginning of the decade, and costs have declined tremendously. Now, the cost decline is not only the technological success, and this is an important lesson for nuclear. Our analysis suggests that we attributed to technology, and the other half is the declining cost of capital as governments implemented increasingly robust and reliable regulatory and investment frameworks. Wind and solar very strongly benefited from the ultra-low interest rates in the world economy. And this is important for nuclear because we have seen a good natural laboratory is the United States, where some states decided to include nuclear power in their clean energy portfolio and clean energy policy measures, others didn't. And we observed that in the states where nuclear power was included in the clean energy investment frameworks, the operators and the utilities find it cost efficient and optimal to invest in extending and maintaining the role of nuclear in the energy system. But with the recent state of technology, I think it's fair to say that wind and solar is certainly the cheapest form of electricity in every situation when space and time is working in your favor. So if you need electricity at noon in Nevada, nothing will beat solar. If you need electricity in a winter evening in the Scottish Highlands, nothing will beat solar. The challenge of electricity systems is increasingly to overcome the limitations of space and time. And in this respect, there was also a significant technological progress in what we call the software of the clean energy system, the ability of the system operators to deal with increasing amounts of renewable energy and integrated in a cost-efficient fashion. To a large extent, this was due to the systematic application of the Internet of Things on the electricity system. That led to, for example, much more precise forecasting of renewable energy production, taking advantage of big data capabilities. But there was also a success in regulatory design as well. I would, for example, highlight the progress that Europe has made in improving the utilization of the existing electricity transmission network by rolling out decentralized market coupling and integrating electricity markets. Now, if we had all this technological success on both the hardware, better wind turbines, and also the software, better system integration, do we still need nuclear power? That is a very legitimate question. And as you know, there are important countries like Germany, which decided to embark on a journey of decarbonizing their electricity systems while phasing out nuclear power. I believe that is possible. I have no doubt that the German strategy will succeed eventually. Having said that, we also advising governments that, of course, every country has a sovereign right to decide whether to use nuclear power or not. The nature of the technology is such that it requires a high-level political decision. But in countries, including the United States, China, India, United Kingdom, France, Brazil, where they have not adopted a legally binding anti-nuclear position, our advice to governments have been that even after the recent technological progress, an optimal decarbonization pathway does include a role for nuclear power, and we have been advising them to have the appropriate measures in place to safeguard the contribution of nuclear. And the reason for this is twofold. One is system integration. The recent success of system integration to a considerable degree relied on the fact that both Europe and also the United States had a relatively new large gas turbine fleet. Now, this was a result of a historical accident. The utilities invested into gas turbines on the basis of much more optimistic electricity demand expectations, leading to major value destruction. And of course, in a purely decarbonized electricity system, there will be hard questions about those gas turbines. The electricity storage investment is increasing, and electricity storage technology is improving, but we don't think that, that battery storage will be able to replace all the system services of dispatchable generation in the foreseeable future. We run a specific scenario where we ask the question, what ultra cheap batteries could deliver? And if we found that even if battery costs decline to a very, very low level, an additional 3 gigawatt of battery deployment displaces only 1 gigawatt of dispatchable generation capacity, because batteries and dispatchable capacity operate at different time horizons. Batteries, for batteries, the average battery storage time currently is only 2 hours. So that's primarily used for frequency control. With low battery costs, we think that this will increase to around 4 hours, but that's the end of the road. Whereas power systems have to maintain flexibility also in the weekly and monthly time horizons. Nuclear reactors are not ideal for the short-term fluctuations of the power system, but their baseload generation and the ability to store fuel on site for a long period make them quite well suited to mitigate the long-term fluctuations of power systems. Another very important factor is the limitations of space, namely the electricity network. The building of the electricity network for a very large wind and solar penetration is proving to be challenging in practically every country. Now, nuclear power plants, of course, are already connected to the high voltage transmission grid, and any new nuclear development is almost certain to be at a brownfield site where the transmission capacity is already there. When we try to analyze an energy transition without nuclear power, we came to the conclusion that it would not only require much more investment in renewables, but it would also require around $600 billion additional investment into electricity networks, which might be socially and politically extremely challenging, even if the money is available. So last but not least, I should mention grid stability and system inertia, where the question of maintaining grid stability with ultra-high shares of wind and solar penetration is still an unsolved problem. There is a promising technological innovation on the field of power electronics, but the required power electronics techniques have not yet been deployed in large scale. There is still a degree of technological uncertainty. Whereas, of course, nuclear power plants generate electricity with a steam turbine. And from the point of view of grid stability, it doesn't really matter whether the steam turbine is powered by a coal boiler or whether it is powered by a nuclear reactor. It can provide the same grid stability services. So overall, we think that both from the point of view of costs, also from the point of view of social and political difficulties, and also from the point of view of electricity security, in countries where the nuclear option is politically accepted, it is definitely worth keeping nuclear power in the game, and it definitely should play a role in a cost-efficient decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you highlighting the issue about transmissions. I think this is, as Jan pointed out in his initial presentation, there are factors that go with some energy generation sources that sometimes aren't captured when people quote the costs for that particular energy source, and transmission is certainly one. And you mentioned a number of $600 billion. Is that a global number, or was that what was that number exactly?
So essentially, this was an analysis which we conducted, where basically we asked the question that every OECD country, so we focused the analysis on the OECD region, where the nuclear capacity currently is aging. And basically, we assume that every nuclear plant in OECD countries is decommissioned at its current licensed lifetime. So no new nuclear construction, no investment in lifetime extensions. But we also said no compromise, forced enough renewable energy into the system to achieve that. Unsurprisingly, there was a much higher investment need in renewable energy. But what was also striking is that the investment need into the electricity network also jumped by this $600 billion number. And the reason for this is that if we keep nuclear, then we continue operating the existing nuclear reactors with lifetime extensions. And even for new nuclear construction, in both Europe or in the United States, it's almost guaranteed that new nuclear construction would take place at an existing site, which already has an existing ultra-high voltage transmission connection.
Right. I think in many countries, that's largely what we have seen, that existing nuclear plant sites are hosting additional reactors as opposed to greenfield sites. There are some greenfield sites, but not very many, certainly not in OECD countries. You mentioned in passing the issue about managing, I think the phrase you was time and space. And I think that was an interesting way of putting it. And I think the example you talked about how certain parts of the year, the conditions are different and the generation will be different for different renewables. And that reminds me of a period when I worked in the United States, where we had a very cold, dark winter in the Midwestern states. And there was a huge amount of snow and ice on the ground. The rivers were frozen. And I remember that people were concerned because the rivers were so frozen, you couldn't move any coal to the power plants. And the only thing that was keeping the lights on in the Midwest during that period was, of course, the nuclear power plants. And I often wonder, when you think about situations where countries move towards very high percentage reliance on variable renewables, what happens if you get an extreme winter or something like that? Because in extreme winters, often you don't see much wind. Sun, of course, is very difficult because everything's covered in snow and ice. How in your analysis, how do countries deal with those situations? How do they prepare for that in the future? I hope we haven't lost you. I think we have lost our chief economist from IEA. Well, I'll let that question hang out there and move on to the next speaker while we get him back. And the next speaker is Mr. Jae-Koo Lee, who is a professor at Jimcheon University, Korea. He was formerly Senior Vice President for Marketing Department of Korea Electric Power Company's Energy Engineering and Construction Company. Prior to this position, he had participated in the design, engineering, construction, and startup of more than 10 nuclear units over the last 20 years. Pretty impressive experience. And most recently, he was a mentor of the World Nuclear University Summer Institute in 2017, 18, and 19. So I'll try to get there next time myself, and perhaps we'll run into each other. Mr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Bill, 1 year before we met in Romania in WNU, long time no see. Yeah, however, nice to meet you again. Okay, I'm Jae-Koo Lee from Korea. I would like to introduce the cost effectiveness of nuclear energy in Korea. How did we reduce cost for nuclear energy, and how did we upgrade the cost effectiveness and competitiveness of nuclear energy here in Korea? Okay, next slide. About 40 years ago, in 1970s, at that time, Korea was not so industrialized, but Korean government decided to develop our economic volumes. That's why we need huge amount of electricity. But as you know well, Korea does not produce large amount of natural resources. Almost nothing we produce natural resources inside. That's why almost the energy resource we import from outside, from overseas. over than 96%. Not only coal, natural gas, but also oil, everything. That's why at early stage of nuclear industry, at that time, government decided we need to find out semi-domestic energy resource. We chose nuclear energy in 1970s. As you know, where nuclear energy is a kind of a technology-oriented energy resource. That's why. But at that time, we had nothing about nuclear technology. That's why. How did we make technology self-reliance in a short period? That's first challenge to us. Next slide. Move on next. The first keyword given to us was technology self-reliance. We chose a step-by-step approach, not rush too much. For the first couple of units, we made a turnkey basis contract. That's why we learned what is the nuclear. Second stage, for the couple of next nuclear power plants, we made a component basis contract rather than turnkey. Of this contract, we learn importing major technologies. And another couple of nuclear units, we developed technologies. In 15 years, we finished, completed technology self-reliance. I believe this is shortest period to build up their own brand nuclear models in the world. Move on next. After completing technology self-reliance, the next mission given to us was how do we reduce cost of nuclear power plant construction money, cost? How do we make a #1 competitive nuclear models? That's why we began standardization programs. Not only engineering side, but also construction, operation, management service, all sectors of nuclear business. We redesign building arrangement. We redesign all kind of facility layout. We rewrite construction manual, operation manual, and management manuals. Standardization is very, very important to reduce the cost of nuclear energy, I believe. In 10 years, we standardized 2 models of nuclear power plant. They call it APR 1400 and APR 1000. Move on next. Please, next page. We finished 2 message keywords. First one was technology self-reliance. Second one is standardization programs. Next, how do we build up robust, strong supply chains? Government gave an exclusive role to major organizations. For example, for commissioning and operation, KEPCO do everything in Korea. Nuclear power plant design and engineering roles, KEPCO ENC do everything. And nuclear fuel, KEPCO NF. Maintenance service, KEPCO KPS. And construction, private company, Hyundai, Samsung, GS, Daewoo, some others. And manufacturing, Doosan Heavy Industry, Hyundai, Hyosung, some of them. But we gave a kind of exclusive roles for each components between state-owned company and private company. we built a very, very strong harmonization. Based on this kind of robust supply chain, we made some miracles. Next pages. About 10 years ago, 2009, we were invited to participate in UAE international bidding process for 4 units of nuclear power plant at Paracas site. As you know, where all major players in the world were invited into the games. To Korea team, it was the first challenge. We never tried this kind of exporting business, but we've tried. You know, who was a winner? We did, we made. Why? Why UAE chose Korean team? We gave us something different. For the first 30 years, we have built up 30 units of nuclear power plant. Every year, we start new nuclear power. Everywhere, we start commercial operation. Abundant experience we had. No other countries had this amount of abundant experience, real experience, engineering, construction, commission, everything. And at that time, we had number one, world most operation performance. And one package, everything from A to Z. Korean team, robust supply chain, handles everything. And strong confidence we gave to UAE. That's why even first challenge we made. Move on, next page. On this slide, now in Korea, how about the generic cost by engineering source, energy source? Look at here, to generate 1 kilowatt hour electricity, we spent 61. But in case of coal, 85, about 1.5 times higher than nuclear cost. In case of LNG, 120 about 2 times expensive than nuclear cost. Renewable, 30 times higher than nuclear cost. That means still nuclear is very, very competitive in Korean societies. Without nuclear background, I don't think Korea could make this kind of economic miracles. Okay, next. This morning, I read a news articles on World Nuclear News saying UAE completed construction of Paracas Unit 2. That means even in 10 years, Paracas nuclear project are going through on schedule, within budget, with high quality. That has proven Korean nuclear energy effectiveness and competitiveness in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Very, very interesting presentation and a good history, because I know that for many years, Korea was seen as the ideal model for how to adopt nuclear technology by countries. That seems to have changed, though, don't you think? There's a lot of countries that are looking for a much faster start than what Korea practiced when it adopted nuclear energy.
I think there are two approach methods for nuclear energies. For the matured market or emerging market is quite different. When I'm asked from underdeveloping countries, emerging countries, how do we get nuclear energy benefit best? I explain, don't rush please, step by step, don't rush, step by step. Then you will find out something new. Even in jumping high up above the hurdles, you know, we must be careful of getting injured, falling down, because no one can get rid of gravity, right? That's why, even though energy is very important, very rushed, but we should keep quiet and control our mind. But for the matured market, I want to give this kind of message. If you want to reduce cost, upgrade effectiveness and competitiveness, think about better standardization programs for not only engineering design, but also operation, commissioning, construction, project management, maintenance, all of the sectors. You have to make a kind of a standardization that makes you something. Release, minimize risk and uncertainty of next step, and license, permission, all of the things, schedule delay, you know that. Okay.
Well, one of the things about the Baraka project that's most impressive, I think, is that it was constructed pretty much on time and within budget, and in a foreign country. Do you think that success can be easily replicated if Korea were to export the same technology to other countries, or do you think there were unique aspects to the UAE that made that easier?
Yes, of course, replication might be one of the factors we could do this kind of a good performance. And the other one I can guess, between Korea and the UAE, and between KEPCO and NF, now in UAE, we built a strong, deep trust, confidence. That makes this kind of a success, I believe. Without trust or confidence, no one can do this kind of something.
Well, thank you, and we'll go to the next speaker. But please, I'm sure we'll have a good discussion. I'll end this part by noting that that this technology, the APR 1400, is the only non-U.S. technology to be certified by the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that's that many have tried, but this Korean project was the only one to actually make it through the whole process. So it's obviously a good technology. So let me move on to Kirsty Gogan, and we had already had a Yogi Berra quote earlier. I'll give you another one with Kirsty back. It's like deja vu all over again. Kirsty is co-founder and executive director of Energy for Humanity, an environmental NGO focused on large-scale, deep decarbonization and energy access. And Kirsty's been with us before. She's a very good friend and ally of the NEA, and we look forward to her comments today. Kirsty, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me again. And I'm especially delighted today, given this topic that is, of course, is close to all of our hearts, achieving the overall goal of, emissions-free, affordable, reliable, resilient, and flexible energy systems. And we've just completed a study, which we hope will be a valuable contribution to this discussion, and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share some of the key findings with you today. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So we've just finished a study for the US ARPA-E Meitner program to help support upstream design decisions by advanced reactor developers to help them really develop useful products for future energy markets. And we think it's the first study to derive the highest allowable capital costs for advanced reactors by modeling their performance in 4 of the major power markets you can see here on this map in the United States in the year 2034. So there's two reasons why we think this study is really important, and we were really delighted to have the opportunity to do this study. Firstly, because it's really critical for advanced reactor designers to make really well-informed upstream design decisions today that will ensure that they can deliver really useful products that are cost competitive into the market as they're commercializing in 2034 or in the early 2030s. So this study helps to define what those market requirements will be. And secondly, we find that right now, almost all mainstream future energy systems modeling, including those with really high penetrations of variable renewables, don't represent the role that advanced reactors can play. In fact, advanced reactors appear to be almost entirely absent from future energy systems modeling. And as a result, what we see is very large projections of very substantial fossil fueled generation, even as far out as 2050. In other words, there's a lot of gas still on the system, and that's needed to provide dispatchable generation to complement high penetrations of variable renewables. So the second sort of purpose really of this study is to really socialize amongst grid operators, energy systems modelers, policymakers, an alternative path, and really show the real value that these flexible and clean products can have in lowering emissions and lowering costs actually across the whole of future electricity systems. So there's two key future market requirements that we need to pay attention to here. Firstly, price, and then secondly, what are the performance characteristics that will create not only the most value for plant owners and investors, but also towards our larger goal of delivering affordable, reliable, flexible, and above all, genuinely clean, fully decarbonized electricity systems. So firstly on price. So our key conclusion is that the advanced reactor developers really have to design for really tough future market environments that are going to exist when their plants become commercially available. So it's going to be really critical that they have a really clear understanding of what these plants should cost to be attractive investments. And our findings are that advanced reactors need to cost less than $3,000 a kilowatt to be attractive investments for owners within these really highly competitive future power markets. If they can achieve those cost targets, there's going to be very large markets for those advanced reactors that cost less than $3,000 a kilowatt. And then secondly, on performance, future energy systems that have really high penetrations of variable renewables, as we said, are going to need complementary, clean, dispatchable generation. So alongside those cost targets, performance is going to be key. So if you could go to the next slide, please, we'll put this sort of performance concept into context. So here we see one example of one of the four markets that we analyzed, which is PJM. It's the largest one. And you can see this shows installed capacity for PJM in 2018. 2018 is shown on the left-hand bar, and then the series of scenarios that we examined in 2034. So we based our scenarios on the National Renewable Energy Lab scenarios for both high and low renewable energy penetrations. We assumed low renewables costs and low gas costs in the high renewables penetrations. And you can see that those scenarios that didn't include any advanced nuclear, you can see them quite clearly here. There's a large purple, the big purple chunk showing natural gas in these scenarios without any advanced nuclear. And then we also modeled in advanced reactors combined with thermal energy storage, which are shown here in pink. So you can see the low renewables and renewable scenarios, high renewable scenarios. And if you go to the next slide, please, I'm going to show you what happened in terms of generation for these scenarios. So here you can really start to see how fleet deployment of advanced reactors combined with thermal energy storage complement wind and solar in markets with high penetrations of renewables, and indeed can really enable higher penetrations of variable renewables in future energy systems. By combining the nuclear plants with thermal energy storage, this really enables the nuclear to be a peaking resource instead of just a baseload resource, allowing it to store energy, in other words, instead of just turning it down. So making nuclear into a capacity source in this way, it makes it really a direct alternative to combined cycle gas. So our recommendation is to reactor developers is to design nuclear plants to play that role with these performance characteristics. And you'll notice as well that the renewable generation remains really consistent across those scenarios because the advanced reactors are replacing the gas. So this really doesn't have to be a fight between renewables and nuclear. If you go to the next slide, please. So I've mentioned this, this thermal energy storage. Now, a fleet deployment of advanced reactors combined with energy storage systems, shown here as ESS, you'll see, that can meet these cost targets, can lower the total cost of energy delivery within the ISO. And you can see this in the table showing the total cost of serving the annual load for each of the 4 power markets. Now, developers will obviously note that higher renewable penetrations that are shown here also reduce the average energy prices and therefore also impact on the allowable CapEx. So developers need to aim for a CapEx as a result of this of less than $3,000 a kilowatt. And increasing or decreasing the average weighted average cost of capital by a percentage point changes the maximum allowable CapEx by around 8 or 9%. Fuel costs and fixed O&M expenses are also really material considerations. As these decrease, the allowable CapEx will also increase. And then the 12-hour thermal energy storage system also enables higher allowable CapEx, assuming it receives capacity payments. And we assumed capacity payments based on today's levels. So across the ISO's modeled, co-locating energy storage systems makes economic sense on average for less than $1,100 a kilowatt. And without storage, plant's capacity factor will of course suffer in zones with high variable renewables. So only really by designing to those clear cost and performance targets will reactor developers be successful in delivering large-scale market transformation. And flexibility without that thermal storage, could be good for the grid with high penetrations of variable renewables, but it doesn't necessarily benefit a plant's revenue because, as we've heard, of course, nuclear plants inherently want to run at their maximum rated output. So making the flexibility economic for nuclear producers is really a critical piece of this. And we've modeled in thermal energy storage, but it could also require, for example, market reform in order to achieve that economic benefit from flexibility. The final thing on this slide to say is just that capacity factor is, of course, really critically important. And we have a mid-range capacity price of around $75 a kilowatt per year, allowing around $2,500 a kilowatt CapEx without energy storage, and around $3,500 per kilowatt CapEx with energy storage. So that's the mid-price capacity price range. And then the next slide, please. So as I said, finally, the goal here really is to reduce emissions whilst maintaining the affordability, reliability, resilience of the energy system. And as Laszlo Varro said in his remarks, the last decade has seen the development of wind and solar generation into really affordable technologies that can make major contributions to the decarbonisation of electricity. However, locking in that dependence on fossil fuels for dispatchable power, as we see in almost all mainstream future energy systems modelling, won't deliver the outcome that we need. So the time really, we feel, has come to realise this expanded role that a wider range of technologies can play in de-risking our pathways to net zero. And our study hopefully is a valuable contribution in showing how flexible advanced reactors can complement and enable high penetrations of variable renewables in future energy systems. We need to really apply the same commitment and creativity combined with the technical, policy, business innovation that's helped successfully commercialize renewables affordably and at scale to support the commercialization and the deployment of these advanced reactor technologies at scale as well. And that's my last slide. Thank you so much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Excellent presentation. Congratulations on this study. Well, let me ask you a question about the study, because it does focus on advanced reactors, but and I haven't read the study yet. But watching your presentation, there really isn't anything. That isn't necessarily just advanced reactors, correct? It could, if Professor Lee can build an APR 1400 for for $3,000 per kW, that would work as well, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we were doing was make the study is less about, you know, sort of what's feasible or, you know, what these things will cost, and it is much more about what these products should cost to meet market requirements in the 2030s. And, you know, you don't get a tougher market than the United States with very low gas prices, very low renewable energy prices. So it's really about helping to inform those upstream design decisions. Now, it could be, and we do see, you know, conventional light water reactors achieving very low costs in Asia, for example. And it's possible that by applying all of the principles of standardization and programmatic benefits, fleet effect sequencing, and so on, you can drive down costs very substantially with large-scale baseload plants. And there will be an ongoing role for large-scale baseload conventional nuclear in our future energy system too. But there's certainly an important contribution that these more likely to be highly manufactured products, that because we're assuming non-light water reactors will also have much simpler systems to achieve very high performance in terms of safety and quality and cost, that they can actually achieve even greater cost reductions.
I think that as we have observed the situation, particularly in OECD countries, when we see these large costs for nuclear plants, it really gets back to some elements that were in sort of the antithesis of some elements that were in Professor Lee's presentation about supply chain, project management consistency, things like that. And even in advanced reactors, and I recognizing why the purpose of your study was to set a cost target for as an economic analysis, it's going to come back to execution as well. It's not simply what the target is. It's really how do you get it built, especially the first units, in a way that doesn't lead to these huge cost overruns. So on top of the cost target, are there also policies that need to be put in place to enable industry to get these technologies into the market in some effective way? I wonder if you could give some opinion about that.
Yeah, I think there's you know, there's certainly opportunities to create the right sort of market facilitative actions, incentives that we've seen being really quite successful for offshore wind, for example, where, you know, you have a commitment to purchase a certain amount of the product for a certain price, and that can help incentivize developers and investors to deliver against those cost targets. An auction-based approach, so the kind of competitive procurement-based approach, could actually be very successful in driving the kinds of commitments and investments that are required to deliver these the pipeline of orders that will support the investment to drive down costs and increase rates of deployment.
And this sort of harkens back to something that Professor Kepler was talking about in his opening presentation about, and this is, I think in a previous panel discussion, this came up as well, that the market is a great way of rationalizing the resources that are on the grid today, but are a horrible way of planning future investments. But that's what we do today. So how do we, and I'm going to open this up to them. I'm going to let you answer first, but then see what others think. What do we need to do to change that? What are the policies that need to be advanced to convince governments that investment has to be separated from the market?
Yeah, I mean, there's really, you know, obviously we have to be very strategic to achieve the goals, the decarbonisation goals within 30 years. We need to start now. And our conclusions, we think, should really motivate those ISO operators, public utility commissioners, policymakers, utilities, other stakeholders looking ahead to their sort of strategic planning to really investigate the role that these products could play in the grids of the future, and start representing them in their planning. You know, these are important customers and that will be needed in order to support the commercialization efforts of these developers. So we really hope that this study is going to motivate organizations responsible for national, international energy modeling to really include these flexible advanced nuclear energy products with energy storage in their projections and future energy systems. And even that presence in the thinking is going to support the business case, the investor case, the commercialization case as well as other market incentives that will be needed along the way.
Let me see what Scott thinks about this. What do you see in terms of the market? How does the market need to change to be able to accept these technologies with these large upfront investment costs that maybe over 40 years are a great investment, but are very difficult to pay for when you start them? That seems to be the nature of nuclear today. How do you see things changing?
That's a very good question, and it's actually a debate that's been going on for many years. I've had arguments with colleagues from a previous life where there was discussions about, do you want an energy-only market? Do you want to have a capacity market? And as long as you don't have the kind of deep financial markets that allow you to do the hedging of exposure that you might have, that creates the need for a capacity market. And in reality, what you would require is some kind of a forward capacity market, because you want to be able to anticipate capacity shortfalls in the future. What you end up with, and this comes not just about nuclear, but also about renewables, there needs to be some concept of the boundary of the marketplace should be the electrical energy boundaries and not the national or state boundaries. That you need to have well-designed markets for balancing markets, for energy markets, and for capacity markets. And if you get the right signals coming through, people are actually buying ahead their energy security. Now, one final remark I'll make is this concept of energy security. Many places, countries, tend to call energy security as energy independence. I personally, and the UN more broadly, doesn't accept energy dependence equals energy security. Energy security can be delivered by diversification of technology, diversification of sources, and any other number of factors. So yes, having the capacity that's required going forward will be essential. I haven't even talked about the demand side, but I've gone on too long, so I'll stop there.
Jan, let me give you a chance to comment on this as well.
Well, it's a huge subject, so I only want to sort of give a few pointers. Financing high fixed cost, low carbon technologies will be the key issue in electricity market design discussions in the years to come. But I would say one size will not fit all. You see sort of forward hedging of demand. That was, of course, or supply. That was, of course, what the original sort of market designers had in mind. It doesn't really go beyond 2-3 years, and even for a gas plant, it's not enough. That's why capacity markets were created. And for gas plants with the fixed cost you have there, capacity markets work by and large quite well. However, if you have more capital intensive technologies such as nuclear and renewables, capacity markets don't work anymore. And then, of course, the sort of the holy grail would be to have sort of technology neutral auctions for 10, 20, 30 years ahead of supply. And you see, it doesn't really work because it's sort of the nature of the product is too different and all that. So you have separate auctions. You basically have governments setting targets. We want 10 gigawatts of wind onshore, offshore, nuclear. And then you have technology-specific auctions. That works quite well, in fact, in the field of renewables, and costs really have come down. For nuclear, we're not there yet. We're more sort of in a sort of bespoke approach where you have contracts for difference or the UAE. We don't really know how the regulated tariffs are actually set. We would love to know, but clearly sort of some it's not a liberalized market price. So it really is much more of a bespoke approach still in nuclear. So the next challenge, I think, would really be to have a slightly more competitive approach, which couldn't really be a really open auction, but perhaps something in between for nuclear. So it really will be technology specific. And then again, you have other models still, such as the Finns with their Mankala model and so forth. So yes, there will be some sort of forward guarantees for revenues for all low carbon technologies, or for all technologies, in fact. But for the time being, there will be technology specific, and I think the key challenge will be to optimize those mechanisms. I think the overall debate is coming back. I think everybody sort of in the business is recognizing that need for the direction of reform towards the financing of long-term investment. But I think the modalities still have to sort of be worked out and optimized in the years, 2-3 years to come. But the debate is ongoing.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question then, because the way I think each of you have talked, it sort of hints towards a large degree of government control. Do you think we're heading that way? Is that the inevitable future for the governments just to take control of the markets and just to run them to achieve whatever outcome they think they want to have? Anyone want to jump into that one?
If given that my mic is open, I'll just be very quick. I think low carbon electricity markets will require a greater involvement of governments than we originally thought. And in particular, given the fact that we don't have a stable and robust carbon price signal, I do think that some capacity targets for low carbon technologies will be required for the medium term.
Anyone else want to comment? Kirsty, any comment on that? I hope we haven't lost Kirsty. We've already lost one panelist. Please,
well,
Scott.
We certainly hope.
Oh, wait. Go ahead, Kirsty.
Well, I was very briefly. I mean, we particularly investment in energy infrastructure with high costs and low operating costs. What we spend is very low marginal costs across the energy system. You have to define a market mechanism in order to create a return on the investment. So, but yeah,
Oops, we just lost Kirsty. They're dropping like flies. Scott, I think you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I do, and I don't mean to be excessive on this, but I'm not sure I would want the governments to be as in control as you've just described. To my view, there are 3 key players in this. The first is governments need to set the framework conditions that allow markets to play. That's market design, those are market rules, and the rest of it. The second one is the industry itself that provides the capital and provides the management skills. And then the third one is the capital markets that provide the financing for investment. I think those need to be brought into alignment so you get the outcomes you require. But I don't think you'd want to assign to government all of the responsibilities for delivering what the energy sector should deliver. I think the idea of innovation, creating a playing field where many players can come in, we are witnessing a transition with distributed generation, with digitalization and the rest of it. If we stay with the energy market we have today, I don't think we're allowing for a lot of changes that are coming down. So I would prefer to stay with each player playing its proper role. Thank you.
Thank you. Kirsty, before we lost you, you were in the middle of a sentence, I think.
Thanks. I'm not sure which part you heard, but I was talking about the difficulty with the investor case for high capital cost infrastructure with low operating cost. And then as a result, as you increase the penetration of very low marginal cost electricity generation onto the system, as we saw in one of my slides, you end up with a power price which is extremely low, and therefore market mechanisms absolutely will be needed to support a return on investment. And in our case, we looked at the capacity price to enable that. Thanks.
Good. Thank you. Let me ask, there's a question from the audience, and let me start with Professor Lee. So one of the things that and I think the urgency in Scott's presentation highlighted this, that we need to have relatively quick implementation of some strategy. And the questioner says that in his analysis, the average construction time between beginning of construction and bringing a reactor to the grid over the last decade has been at least 10 years. And if it takes 10 years to build one reactor, and then if the costs, and then his follow-up point is he thinks that, I'm not sure, he says it comes from Lazard Bank, but he says that nuclear power generating costs have increased 26% over the last decade, which doesn't sound like numbers I've heard, but that I haven't looked at that particular analysis, while wind and solar have dropped dramatically. And so the question is, if nuclear takes too long to build and is more expensive than renewables, then why is it a good idea? And maybe Professor Lee, you could start and respond to that.
I want to give my ideas. First one, as they mentioned, it takes a long time to build up one nuclear power plant. So from designing to commercial operation, it might be more than 10 years. And sometimes schedule delay, it takes 15, 20, 30 years beyond their controls. That's why public think, wow, nuclear is expensive and beyond their controls. To overcome this kind of situations, first one is modernization. Standardization. To minimize, to release uncertainty and the risk of schedule, long time, license, construction permission, operation permission. Without standardization programs, no way, I guess. That's why in nuclear industries, we focus on reduce cost through standardization and small, quicker. And all kind of uncertainty should be removed in advance. That means before starting nuclear project, over than 80% of engineering design should be fixed out. Then that kind of uncertainty and risk we can manage it easily.
Well, thank you very much. And Kirsty, I'd like to have you comment on this, because I think you alluded a bit to a part of this answer I think you're going to give when you talked about the advanced reactors. So maybe you'd like to comment on this.
Oh yeah, well, okay. You'll have to tell me if I'm supposed to say something else. But I was going to say, you know, renewables didn't start out cheap. They got cheap through a really coordinated, concerted, intentional, deliberate effort from the industry, through policy support, you know, through market incentives, through investment. And, you know, that should be seen really as a sort of template for success that, you know, we should now apply to the other zero carbon technologies that we need to achieve full decarbonisation, because all of the modelling indicates that we will not achieve the decarbonisation that we need within the 30 years that we have. In fact, we don't really have 30 years. We really need to start now. The next 5 years are absolutely critical. Without a broader, diverse range of technologies across heat and power and transport and industry. So the other thing I just wanted to say is that we do actually have very credible pathways within our own industry as well to cost reduction. And the report that the NEA published last week is the most recent evidence base demonstrating real potential for very meaningful cost reduction that is based on evidence from good experience today, current experience as well as historical experience. So we have the roadmap, we have the template, we know how to do this, and really it's a question of you know, this sort of the fully coordinated and deliberate effort to do that that's required.
Thank you very much. And we're already over time, believe it or not. But I'm going to use the amazing powers of the Director General and steal a few more minutes to give Scott a chance to answer a very more broad question, and maybe more of a political question. So I'm going to try to get you in trouble here. But what we clearly see, and I think Kirsty said that isn't in her presentation, this really is not a matter of nuclear versus renewables. It really is, and I think you said in your presentation, is bringing all the resources that we can to bear to attack the problem. But many people do see it as nuclear versus renewables, and I think it's more largely on the side of people who are renewable advocates, that they just don't want to have the conversation about nuclear. It seems to be more a political and a policy and ideological. And I'm sure in the UN system you run into this quite a bit. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. How do we get the people who think that they're in the catbird seat, that they have that they have the public behind them? The policymakers are always talking about about wind and solar. Nuclear is complicated. Nuclear is harder. Nuclear has history. But, so how do we get not the public, because the public, I think, is not as challenging as people think it is. I think it's really policymakers. How do we deal with policymakers?
Yeah, I have one idea. Renewable energy is one of the best carbon-free energy, but everybody should know renewable energy do not produce electricity for 24 hours. That's why renewable energy could not be used for baseload electricity. For 20 hours, for 24 hours a day, they could not generate electricity. No wind, no solar light in night. That's why in case of renewable energy, always overlap investment should be installed, such like LNG, natural gas, coal, or some other factors. That's why, generally speaking, nuclear should take a role for baseload electricity. And middle zone, renewable, could be good solution. But overlap investment, peak times, LNG or coal will be backup power. That means nuclear should be baseload power, and renewable be mid-band electricity, and peak power load might be covered by gas, oil, or the other resources. That's why renewable could not be replaced with baseload nuclear. That's my point.
Well, thank you. And I do wish that Mr. Varro had been here to answer my question about the deep winter. It would have been good to see what his response was. I think it would have been interesting. Scott, I'm going to give you the last word if you want to just wrap up.
The last word, that's a tall order. To my view, before I joined the UN, I was a management consultant working with companies on what do they want to do when they grow up. And invariably, the first question we wanted to ask ourselves is, what's the right question to ask? Because often if you're not asking yourselves the right question, you're certainly not going to get the right answer. And I find that in the UN context with SDG 7, one of the three key parts of SDG 7 is increasing the share of renewables in the energy system. And that's a politically correct conversation that folks have. To my view, that's actually the wrong question. A second generation question is, how do you reduce the carbon intensity of the energy system? And again, that's actually only part of the problem. Part of it is carbon intensity, trying to find a combination of cost and the most effective mechanisms for reducing carbon intensity. It's absolutely important, but it's only part of it. Then you get back to what I said earlier, is how do you deliver on integrated solutions for sustainable development that includes not only climate, but also development? no pun intended, but you're getting warmer with that kind of a question. Then you say this whole concept of redesigning in the energy transition that we're facing. It seems to me, and I'm not a nuclear expert, so y'all can yell at me, nuclear is actually caught up in the wrong conversation because we're looking at it as an engineering culture and comparing cost per kilowatt, cost per kilowatt hour, etc. And we need to change that conversation slightly and think about what are the range of markets that nuclear can address. And you've got this issue of delivering on baseload, as Professor has just said, baseload energy. There's the idea of capacity availability and delivering security of supply. There's a whole range of issues that are out there that are quite important. But if you think about nuclear delivering hydrogen, you think about nuclear actually being able to support the penetration of renewables. If you think about nuclear delivering all of these other products that are out there, it should not be presented as us versus them. And if you think nuclear's got an issue, I've got a group dealing with fossil coal capacity. That's a harder conversation, but it's the same one. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And this has been a very interesting discussion. The time always goes fast with these things, so I think there's probably another 24 questions we could be asking. But let me thank all of you for being with us and for your presentations and your insightful comments. And to close with another Yogi Berra quote, it ain't over till it's over. So even though this is the end of this conversation, it's really a long conversation that the world needs to have.